Good morning. I'm Dr. Joe Graham. I'm a senior program officer with the Native American Agriculture Fund, what we call NAAF. I'm here to have a conversation this morning with, um, I'm so happy to be here because I'm talking with Dr. Joe Hiller. Dr. Joe Hiller is Professor Emeritus from the University of Arizona. That's where I did my graduate work. And he is a vice president of the board of trustees of the Native American Agriculture Fund. Uh, Dr. Hiller was my major professor on my dissertation program, and I'm very happy to talk to him. Okay, and I'll let Dr. Hiller introduce himself.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Joe. You've just turned out pretty well, I'd say. Joe Hiller here, Oglala, from Pine Ridge Reservation, Western South Dakota. I'm a retired professor from University of Arizona with time at a couple other 1862 land-grant universities, Wyoming and Alaska. My career has mostly been in the extension side of ag colleges, but my formal training is in range management and watershed management and eco-hydrology and that sort of stuff. So I'll just leave it there before I put people to sleep. Joe?
Okay. Joe, as you were growing up in South Dakota, how was agriculture a part of your life?
Oh boy, that was where the sun got up and went down. It was everything. But I will tell you that, on the ranching communities out on the western side of the Pine Ridge Reservation, it was not lucrative. How's that? It was hard work, not much pay, didn't pay off big. There were always troubles, if you will, always challenges working with the tribe, working with neighbors, because you got to move your cattle around. So you got to rent grass from somebody. So it's either the tribe or Black Hills National Forest or some neighbors with deeded ground inside or outside the reservation. So you're always kind of moving around in that way of life. But also, it was not something that people really aspired to do. I mean, it was basically poor folks out in the country. You didn't have nice cars. You had to keep your church clothes separate from your school clothes, right? So that you didn't look like poor people from the country when you went to town. I would say it's vastly different nowadays. Agriculture back then was not popular. It didn't attract a lot of popular attention like it's beginning to these days. So I could wax on that for quite a while. But
no, that's interesting because that sounds like the theme that goes through it is it was hard. And over in New Mexico, we all on the Laguna Indian Reservation, we all lived a life that included elements of agriculture. We never really considered ourselves farmers, but almost every family had fields. Families had flocks of sheep. People kept a goat, they kept a pig. We had orchard, we had trees. And, the whole summer was about irrigating the cornfield and herding the sheep. And it was a lot of work. And until uranium mining and wage labor took over the place, that it was until then that people started giving up their agriculture kind of style, and everybody kind of kept associated with it. It was hard. It was a hard life. When we were going to sheep camp on Saturday, a couple of our friends whose fathers were in wage labor were going to Albuquerque to the movies. And we were like, why are we at sheep camp? These guys are going to the movies. But that was the thing. It was hard, and people kind of seemed to have an eye on the door, like, I need to get out of here, And so different environments, different approaches, but the underlying theme was that it was hard. And so we're going to talk about a seminal case that came up, the Keepseagle case. But by the 1980s, what were the conditions on the ground for native agriculturalists that led to the Keepseagle case? What were the issues that were being contested?
Simply access to credit. You know, where I'm at right now today, I live in western Nebraska, and I'm around a lot of farming and ranching. I do a little bit of that myself, but I'm just still, I've been amazed at how much money you go through in this business. You know, the amount of capital that you've got to have access to is tremendous. Even if you compare even Northern Great Plains farming operations versus Northern Great Plains ranching operations. Ranching operations are basically by definition a little bit lower input. You've got fencing, you've got tractors and trailers, veterinary supplies, transportation supplies, and so on. But in farming, if you've got a combine or a couple of tractors, you're already at $500,000 in capital investment alone, just there. I bought a tire for a loader the other day, $2,300, $2,300 for a loader tire. It's crazy. So if you got all that money in your checkbook, fine. Nobody does. So you got to have access to a lot of credit. And historically, at least where I grew up, all the creditors were in Rapid City or Chadron or Denver, all off the reservation and all not eager to loan you money or underwrite an operating loan for you. You know, borrow $300,000 a year. At the end of the year, you just pay the interest off and roll the loan over to next year. Gives you an idea. The interest on that's going to be 20 grand. That might give you a peek at what your profit is. You still got that 300,000 that you got to have access to next year. And so on and on it goes, kind of like the stories of being in debt to the company store for the miners in West Virginia, and so on. So it's hard to get credit in the first place for agriculture unless you've got a really good, clean, strong balance sheet that cash flows. And nobody did that. If you kept receipts, they're all in a shoebox. If you kept a checkbook, yeah, it was either on the dash of the pickup or somewhere. I haven't seen it for a while, you know. And that's not to denigrate anybody that's doing this business of agriculture back then, but creditors became tighter and tighter, more proscriptive on what you had to have in order to get a loan. And finally, many of the creditors were not interested in underwriting a loan that they couldn't get some collateral on, like your land. Well, you can't collateralize this loan because that's tribal land. I'm just leasing it. Well, it has some value, right? Well, yeah, it does, but it's not my value. Well, okay, we'll just take that off your balance sheet as an asset that's not there. And pretty soon you get down and you get down and you've got no collateral. I mean, that's how come, you know, when I was growing up, anyhow, so many of the houses on the Pine Ridge had wheels under them. They could be collateralized if they had wheels on them. They could be taken by the bank, but they can't have the land, right? See, so your biggest asset was land that couldn't be collateralized. So if you were lucky and got a loan, it was a small one, and it was never enough. So access to capital is kind of what this all leads to. And when farmers and ranchers, particularly ranchers up in Western North Dakota and Oklahoma, South Dakota, and so on, were trying to get a hold of some of this capital to keep their operations going, and maybe in Goodyear expand it a little bit, modernize it. and they couldn't get capital, they could go to the lender of last resort, which was USDA. And the short story of the Keeps Eagles and this lawsuit that led to the creation of the Native American Agriculture Fund is those loan officers either slow walked or no walked those loan applications in basically a discriminatory fashion. So farmers and ranchers from Indian country trying to work with the lender of last resort, it failed. And so it led to the class action. Yeah.
That's so interesting because like I mentioned in our place over there, it's that agriculture life was just part of the culture. So I don't think people even really saw themselves as farmers, never considered themselves farmers. And but we had different cattlemen's associations on our reservation, and they may have been facing the same things that you're talking about there. And the most of the community members wouldn't have even known, because the cattlemen's associations were further out on the range, and they could have been facing those same circumstances, and we would have had no idea. Only the cattlemen and associations would have known. So how did that case go? What were the outcomes, and did the litigation lead to any new policies at the federal level?
Well, the case turned out to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. There were, oh boy, I'd have to look. You might have to double check me on the website. In excess of 4,000, I believe, class action plaintiffs. The court settled for the plaintiffs and were awarded, I don't know, $760 million, I believe, in damages that were parsed out to the plaintiffs in cash payments of, I don't know, $50,000 or something like that, and a relief from the debt that they had on the books. So you get a check and you get a clean slate for all the plaintiffs. Some plaintiffs got a little bit more if they were like lead plaintiffs or spent even more torturous time in the courts than others. There was a small handful of those folks. So there was a cash payment to the claimants, and there was money left over. You know, $260 million left over after all those claims were paid. So what do you do with that? The Treasury doesn't want that money back. Some of the plaintiffs said, well, hell, let's just make another trip around the table with more payouts. And so that went back and forth for a number of years on what to do with the surplus money. Ultimately, it led to this creation of the Native American Agriculture Fund. And those monies were dropped into NAAF's hands by court order. We established a board of trustees that were initially appointed by the DC District Court, and stood the organization up. And the purpose of which, is you can read on the website, is to support farming and ranching and other agricultural and food and fiber pursuits in Indian country exclusively. And it's all about agriculture, all about Indian country.
Okay. So what did it take to get the Native American Agriculture Fund off the ground?
Oh boy. You know, it's not something that most of us have done every day. Don't have a lot of experience standing up an organization that's endowed with $250 million. And oh, by the way, part of our formation documents, we have to get rid of that money. This is not a fund that will stand in perpetuity. It has to be $0 20 years after its inception, which was 2018. So I'll just share with you one piece of the problem that's kind of interesting. You know, you go to Wall Street investment houses and say, hey, we got $260 million. Will you invest it for us? And And, you know, everybody was there. Yeah, sure, we'll do that. And then a few of them said, well, maybe not, because, you know, this money came from a lawsuit, so it can probably be taken away by a lawsuit too. So no, I don't think so. And it's Indians, right? You know, we felt a little bit of that going on as we were sort of shopping our bucket full of money up and down Wall Street, get somebody to handle it for us. We don't know, you know. So finally, we found a few investment houses that were interested, and we had to talk with them and said, all right, we'd like to make a little bit of money on this so that we can stay in business as long as possible, but we have to have all this money spent in 20 years. They go, what? It's like, this is really an unusual problem. So one of the things we've had to do is to chart and plan and project and model our spending, not only budget for staff and operations and so on, but how much can we send out the door every year in order to preserve capital? How much capital do we need to preserve and so on? So that's just one of the unique things that this fund is. It's a spend down trust, they call it. That makes it very, very different from other foundations. So one of the many challenges.
You know, a story that the initial CEO, Janie Hip, would tell us. She said that one of the trustees told her it was like going down to John Deere and ordering a tractor. You see the tractor in the showroom, you say, I want that tractor. And then you get a phone call from John Deere, says your tractor's here, and you go down there and they empty out a big giant box of parts in front of you and say, assemble it. You know,
yeah.
Go ahead, there's
You're
your
on your
tractor.
own.
You put it together. And that was the difficulty that there was at setting up NAAF.
Sure. We've had a lot of legal input, which we've needed. And many of us are not accustomed or even comfortable being around lawyers, right? It's like, okay, they talk a different language. But we've all learned through that association, learning how nonprofit organizations work, learning how trusts work, learning ourselves as trustees what fiduciary responsibility means. You know, one of the things, the tendency of a trustee is to get down in the day-to-day business of the trust. Well, you know, we're not paid, get a little stipend, but we're not paid to do day-to-day programming. That's what you, Joe Graham, and others do. Our job is to stay out of your hair, but to point the boat in the direction that we think is where we got to go, and then stay out of your hair and keep you enabled.
We'll come back to your thoughts on NAAF, but one of a program that you've researched in depth while you were at the University of Arizona is the Federal Recognized Tribes Extension Program, FERTEP. And that's a powerful idea. Can you describe the evolution and the potential of that program?
Oh boy, sure. One of my favorite topics is, you know, one of the reasons I took the job at the University of Arizona in about 2000 is because I was able, as I could see in that position, to work with Indian country. Arizona was a national leader already in this FERTEP program. The 1862 land grant universities were established with that as one of the core missions. They had 3 missions: to do teaching. That was the original 1862 legislation says, you're going to teach about agriculture. We have an agricultural country. We need people smart on agriculture. So here's some money to go and do teaching. In 1888 then came along funding and national legislation for agricultural research, for agricultural experiment stations and funding of ongoing research. Then in 1914, the Smith-Lever Act funded the establishment of extension, which extended literally the university's teaching and research out into the country. So in 1914, in cooperation with counties, the land grant universities established these county extension offices. They were called in those days agricultural extension offices, where folks out there were professional educators trained in agriculture and went out and about the countryside proselytizing on how to do agriculture in a scientific way and so on. And those programs grew into include what was then called home economics, canning, home economics, savings plans, and 4-H and youth programs, youth development programs grew out of that. So those 3 core programs existed in virtually every county in the country, but not in Indian country, because USDA looked on the map for, if they're looking on a map for counties in Arizona, they'd see this big blotch up in the northeast corner and say, well, that's not a county, but do our county lines extend up into that reservation, yes or no? And if they do, who's got responsibility to do extension programs up there? Oh, well, let's just forget about it. And run a county extension program off the reservation. And, some Indians want to come, I guess we'll just, okay. But nothing dedicated to Indian country. So extension went about growing all these years from 1914 to today. 97% of all the counties in America have cooperative extension programs, and 3%, maybe 4%, through FERTAP, have extension programs on reservations, and only a few, because they've been competitive funded, grant funded, short-term funding. So we do have a few of those county extension programs where people are adult and community educators focusing on agriculture, family and consumer sciences now, 4-H and youth programs, even small business development and so on. But we're only out there on 30, 35 reservations. We've got like about 530 to go. I think we still have a sort of a discriminatory situation with USDA with respect to extension work in Indian country. Very, very much so. It just, we haven't been able to break that down yet.
Yeah, it's one of those programs that's an incredible idea. It's a really good idea, the way that the state university systems, the state land grant institutions could work with tribes, but it's starved for funding, and the number of personnel compared to the number of reservations is just it's just not.
It's crazy.
Growing. Yeah,
it's absolutely discriminatory, and it continues. And you can do, we've tried to fix this over and over again. Once, 1 year we might get a little bump in funding, but the insidious thing about this program, the way it's set up right now, is county extension programs don't have to write proposals every 3, 4, 5 years for their base funding. None of them do. Only the extension programs on reservations do. And you've got to compete with the other reservation down the road in your state.
yeah.
So one of you is going to get the money, one of you isn't. So you can do all the foot stomping, letter writing, lobbying you want. USDA has been absolutely an immovable object on this point, and we probably should have been part of the Keeps Eagle litigation. There's some people that are continuing to talk about that. This is a USDA responsibility, not a Keeps Eagle responsibility. So we got some issues, but we're working on them.
Yeah, well, in your role, you have an opportunity to work on them. So that brings us back to NAAF. And so what has been the impact of NAAF so far? And what would you ultimately like to see come from NAAF?
Boy, I wish I could come up with the numbers right off the tip of my tongue on how much money we've sent out. $10 to $15 million a year for 3 years now. We've funded a whole host of projects. Please feel free to go on the website, look at them. They're good projects. Some people have come back year after year, maybe rejected 1 year. They've tightened up their proposals and gotten better and better. Always focused on farming and ranching in Indian country, agriculture in Indian country. I think what you'll see in the next few years, excuse me, are some real big plays to permanently endow a scholarship program, for instance, for Indian people in higher education or trades. Go get some education. If you want to be a diesel mechanic and stay home and work and support agriculture in that way, I think we can help you. Or if you want to go get a PhD in biosystematics and be a researcher forever, I think we can help you. So that whole spectrum is available soon in one of our major programs. Another is we're going to fund some banking operations that will directly be available to capitalize agriculture in Indian country. We're working with other major corporations and foundations that are interested in either quietly or publicly supporting work that focuses on agriculture in the Indian country. If you look at it long term, I think the future is tremendously bright. I mean, we have a couple sticky problems in Indian country, like land tenure, but America has some sticky problems in agriculture in that if you just think about foreign ownership of agricultural lands in this country, it's a little bit of a scary number. Look at who owns virtually 100% of the pork processing in this country. It's not US anymore. So there's a whole host of good reasons for us to be optimistic, cheerful, and hopeful working in agriculture in the country. It has national security implications, it has youth development, community development implications, and so on. So a lot of good work.
All right, that's good. In your opinion, how does a successful NAAF contribute to the sovereignty of tribal nations?
Well, we want agriculture to be a viable piece of communities and community economics. And I believe just personally that perfecting or using the land to subsist, or even if you can make a little profit off, sell some hay to your neighbor and so on, is exhibiting sovereignty. That land that you stand on, that you love, that you work on, that you work with, is all about everything about sovereignty. I don't think Indian country is any day soon going to displace Safeway, Kroger's, Fresh, Whole Foods, all those grocery systems and so on of heavily commercialized and industrialized agriculture. Nor do I think that we need to be relegated to only a subsistence way of doing agriculture. You can make some money in this business, maybe not a lot. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is the acme of sovereignty. You get up in the morning and decide how your day is going to go because you're in charge. So.
Very, very well put. Very well put, Dr. Hiller. Okay. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you. So I appreciate this time. I believe we're going to come on the Zoom and we're going to be here for questions and answers for about the next 15 minutes.